America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation, and today we're joined by Tommy Aiello. Tommy is the senior director of government affairs at the National Taxpayers Union, where he leads the advocacy efforts to advance pro-taxpayer and pro-growth policies. That is my language, Tommy. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, I know there's been, it was a great celebration, a great birthday, happy birthday, America, to see the One Big Beautiful Bill get over the finish line. We represent small business owners at the Job Creators Network, and we were pushing really hard for a lot of those provisions. But you wrote a piece about what makes the Big Beautiful Bill really beautiful. And you said that it's one of the most significant conservative victories in recent memory. Why do you think that Republicans aren't talking about it more?
Yeah. Thanks again for having me. I'm a big fan of all the work that you guys do to not only advance the issues of small businesses, but also help deliver this one big, beautiful bill. So I'll just say, let's take a step back. When President Trump won in November, the attention turned to tax policy and how do we make sure that we extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, make sure small businesses and families weren't hit with a $4.5 trillion tax bill at the end of this year. And, there was a lot of skepticism from myself included that we would be able to not only pass, but sign a massive mega law like this before the 4th of July is such a huge accomplishment. When we did TCJA in 2017, it really came down to the wire, and I think we got it signed into law like 6 days before the end of 2017. So the fact that we were able to pass this about 6 months into the president's term is such a massive deal, especially when you look at all the provisions in it. We touch on immigration policy, energy policy, obviously tax policy, and then a number of changes to America's entitlement system. So with all of these things in there, it really is such an accomplishment for Speaker Johnson and the whole Republican Party, for those that voted for it, to get it over the finish line. And I think when we talk about what conservative policy looks like, the One Big Beautiful Bill gets exactly that, right? We reduce taxes on energy producers. We expand the ability for explorers to drill in the Gulf of America and across federal lands. We impose work requirements for those that are receiving federal benefits like Medicaid and food stamps. And then we also include tax certainty, meaning that small businesses won't be hit with a tax increase and they'll have a permanent 20% pass-through deduction, lower rates across the board, and a number of other pro-business, pro-growth items that'll make sure America competes against China in the 21st century. So it really is a mega law that will benefit America across the board.
A mega law is a great way to describe it. And you're right, it does touch on so many provisions. Some of them have gotten a ton of media, obviously, making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. Some of them have gotten a lot of negative publicity on reforming Medicaid, and some of those, love to touch on those a little bit as well. But starting with averting a $4.5 trillion tax increase on Americans, rich, middle class, everybody would have been impacted across the board. And so we brought permanency to the lower tax rates. And those are set because the big problem with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it was a great bill, but it wasn't permanent because of it was passed through reconciliation, which is obviously an in the weeds, boring topic to talk about. But it was passed through reconciliation. And so It had a sunset date. Nobody had to do anything. It was simply going to expire. And that's what we kept telling people was this thing is going to expire at the end of the year. And if we don't do something proactively, and making these lower tax rates permanent was so important. Also, the immediate expensing on R&D, capital investment, being brought back at 100%. And being made permanent, because previously in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there was kind of a phase out period over these years, and it had pretty much gone away, which was, for our small business owners, they said it was just such a major game changer. But when you look at the averting crisis to our economy, this $4.5 trillion tax cut, the Republicans, when I see them talk about the tax bill, they talk about it in terms of a spending bill or tax cuts. And aside from, tell me if I'm wrong on this, but aside from the no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and no tax on Social Security, an additional deduction there for seniors, there really are no new taxes there, because the big criticism has been, oh, that's for the rich. It's tax cuts for the rich on the backs of middle class, I am not aware of many millionaires and billionaires who get overtime or get tips. And so the only new taxes I see are those, very geared towards middle class. But is there a concern at the end of the year when people go to do their taxes that they have an expectation of a tax cut instead of understanding that we averted a tax increase?
Yeah, so I'm looking at it from two different ways. One, we have to tell people that at the end of the year, you would have had a tax hike. That's, if people don't think that they received a tax cut from TCJA, they're not too worried that the TCJA is going to go away, even though about 70% of filers from that law received a tax cut. So I think as we look at some lessons that need to be learned from 2017 is almost every American in across the country got a tax cut, aside from some of the taxpayers in the high tax states like New York, California, and New Jersey. So we need to tell a better story this time that, yes, you did receive a tax cut 8 years ago, and you received another tax cut this go around. And how did they receive the tax cut? Obviously, we avoided a tax increase. That's a very good thing. But then we also included a number of important provisions, including the ones that you had mentioned, but also a higher standard deduction and a higher child tax credit. Those two things, plus the SALT, the state and local tax deduction increase, which we think was flawed at the end of the day, made it into the bill and was one of the reasons why it got into law. So it's just one of those process things that, is an unfortunate occurrence, but we understand the bigger picture. So when you include all of these tax items, we can't find a single group of taxpayers that will be paying more in taxes for this year than they did last year. So I think that's a great thing. Almost every American is going to be paying less in tax next year than they did this year. As Republicans and conservatives, we think that you are a better steward of your money than the federal government. We want to make sure we keep more money in the pockets of small businesses and individual taxpayers that go to Washington. And I think, a $5 trillion tax cut, which is what this bill is, it wasn't all paid for. And I think that needs to be part of the conversation in September and moving forward is, we cut taxes, we reduce spending by about $1 trillion in that law as well. How do we make sure that we put our finances on a path forward, that we don't have to rely on tax increases in the future in order to start to pay down our debt and our deficit? So that needs to be part of this broader concern. But, I think when Americans go to file their taxes, they'll realize that, wow, I did receive a tax cut of maybe $1,000 and potentially much more if you are on, a tipped worker or you are on you're working overtime, that you'll receive quite a significant tax cut because we just hadn't had those tax provisions in law previously. So I think it's all about how we sell these provisions. I think most Americans realize they get a tax cut, even if they don't always want to say that they did, especially for our friends on the other side. So I think that's the big difference between this year and 2017. And the poll numbers for this bill are actually higher than they were for the initial tax bill from a couple years ago. And one thing that we have found is even though most Americans did not think they got a tax cut, even though they did, they very much liked President Trump's economy in 2018 and 2019. And I think a large portion of that can be attributed to the tax bill. So even though they didn't necessarily like that tax bill back then, they liked all the benefits that came from that tax bill, right? More money in their pockets, more high job growth, low inflation, big investment from the business community. I think we're going to see those same thing happen this time around, even if the poll numbers for the one big beautiful bill are still slightly underwater.
I agree with you, recalling how bad the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did in terms of public perception after it passed. I do think that this bill is doing better. I think we need to talk about some of these provisions a little bit more. But you touched on something that I think's really important, and that's the debt and deficit. And I know that was a big contention, for some of the Republicans and the Freedom Caucus in particular, in trying to ensure that we cut as much as we could. And they did a good job as far as, holding feet to the fire on that one. And somebody has to, right? I mean, we just can't keep spending into oblivion. But the same kind of arguments were made about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and adding to the deficit. And then on the big, beautiful bill, when the CBO scores these kinds of bills, there's been some frustration on how they're scored versus what is reality when it comes to tax cuts. Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm sure you're familiar with, the static versus dynamic. How do we address that and kind of explain how that's scored?
Yeah, the Congressional Budget Office, they're like the bean counters of the legislative branch. They always look at different bills and see what the fiscal impacts would be. And look, in theory, where it's supposed to do a really good job. Unfortunately, when Republicans do tax bills, they always score our bills or Republican bills much worse, meaning that on paper, they add significantly to the deficit and to the debt. But when Democrats have their Inflation Reduction Act, the CBO actually says that the law will save money, which is just a ridiculous argument. There's been some papers that have said the bill will cost upwards of $50 trillion because of the clean energy tax credits if they were made permanent from the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think
isn't it kind of logical? A tax cut means less, just on a static basis, less money coming into the Treasury. A tax increase means more money coming into the Treasury. So logically, that's how the CBO gets to where it falls, and why a Democrat tax increase scores much better than a Republican tax cut. But why does that always happen? Because it gives Democrats a talking point that's not true, not fair, and ends up not being reality. Because that's not what happened with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, right?
No, it's not. Look, on paper, when you cut taxes, that's what they look at. But sometimes they don't always look at the downstream economic benefits that you get from cutting taxes. When we dropped the corporate tax rate from 35%, which was the highest in the industrialized world, to 21%, which was a little better than average, we had a huge surge of investment and job creation and wage growth. And all of those things weren't included in the initial CBO score. And I think that's what's going to happen this time around, particularly with some of the provisions related to full and immediate expensing, research deductibility, and interest deductibility. Those are the big three that really spur investment in the United States, plus the 20% pass-through deduction as well, which will help small businesses. So I think when you take all of those things together on paper, right, they cost money. But when you look at it on a holistic basis, yes, it costs money, but it's going to turbocharge the economy, which is going to lead to even faster wage growth, and ideally is going to lead to more tax collections, not less.
So do you all advocate, or do you all know of any groups that do any outside scoring outside of the CBO that comes up with different levels of growth, because they are trying, I know it's impossible to have a crystal ball, but trying to predict a level of growth. I mean, we have history to look at, going back to the Reagan tax cuts, going back to when President Kennedy, was advocating to reduce tax rates when they were at 70%, and that was a Democratic president. So we have enough history to look at. how do we get to a point where there's something that competes with what the CBO says that is taken in a credible way? Because right now, I think a lot of people don't trust what's coming out of some of the government institutions as far as reports like that.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Our sister organization, the National Taxpayers Union Foundation, they have something called the Taxpayers Budget Office, where they look at some of the spending bills and they'll compare it to what CBO has put out, and we'll say, your math isn't exactly right here. When you take into account interest on the debt, what is being proposed is actually much higher than what is initially proposed. And then, of course, the gold standard is the Tax Foundation. They do incredible work to model how different tax bills score, both how much jobs would be created, the revenue impact. And I think they are actually a much stronger predictor of tax bills than what the Congressional Budget Office puts out.
Well, I wish that those reports would have some weight in there. I realize we just passed $37 trillion, and it's going to take, it's going to take real reforms in areas like this bill touched on with Medicaid reforms, which we'll talk about next. But it's going to take spending cuts, Medicaid or social safety net reforms, and it's going to take a vibrant, growing economy where we're seeing investment and growth to get us out of this mess. It's not going to be just taxing the rich. That just isn't going to work in and of itself. And because we already have a progressive tax system, the wealthy carry the bulk of the tax bill anyway. So we're already there. It's like you got to find that balance between encouraging or not discouraging investment. But let's talk about some of the areas. So first off, the other parts of the bill that got a lot of attention is the Medicaid reforms. There's been a lot of scenarios talked about. Millions of people are going to be kicked off their healthcare benefits. Walk us through some of those and why it needed to be done, but what specifically has been done.
Yeah, the Medicaid provisions are the most controversial in the bill, and it's definitely become a rallying cry for some of our friends on the other side that are looking to make it a campaign issue, which I think they certainly will. That was the playbook that they used in 2017. I think they'll find success in it this time around. I would just say a lot of the scare tactics that they have used are just completely overblown. So what the One Big Beautiful Bill did is that it said, if you are receiving Medicaid, which is a government-sponsored healthcare program, you need to work a minimum of 20 hours a week, right? That's about part-time work. If you work 20 hours a week, 80 hours a month, there'll be no change to your status. Now, what does that mean? It's work requirements, but it isn't exactly work. You don't need to work. Work is one part of it. You can also volunteer. You can go to school. You can even look for a job. If you do all of those things, there will be no change to your Medicaid eligibility. And then they always say, older people will be thrown off. Children will be thrown off of the program. That, again, is just not true. What the One Big Beautiful Bill did is it provided a list of exempt individuals, meaning if you have children under the age of 15, there's no change. If you're over the age, I believe it's 64, there's no change. If you have a disability, no change. What they really want to do is encourage more people to get back into the workforce that should be working. That means, able-bodied adults that don't have a job and they don't want to work. We say, if you are receiving a government program, you should have some skin in the game and you should be required to work. We don't think that's a particularly controversial opinion. For the most part, there's been bipartisan support for work requirements. A number of states already have that into law. So it really isn't going to change too much as if you're already if you have a disability or children or anything like that. There's going to be no change. And unfortunately, that is getting lost in the argument, is those exempt individuals, which is unfortunate. But again, that's politics, unfortunately.
Yeah. What about the argument that, the other provision is you have to be an American citizen to participate in the social safety net programs like Medicaid and enforcing those rules? And what I've seen a lot of people say is that's ridiculous provision because you can't get the benefits unless you are an American citizen. So I've made two comments on that. The first is, okay, then why fight the provision? The
Right.
second is, what about the states that are sanctuary states that are letting people who are not citizens into the benefit into Medicaid? I mean, I just don't know how you can deny that there aren't people who are not American citizens getting these benefits.
Yeah, and that's how they're able to get around it, is some of these sanctuary states that allow illegal immigrants to get on the state Medicaid rolls, which of course has the cost sharing with the federal government. And there's been outside analysis that says there's millions of people that shouldn't be on Medicaid, are not eligible for Medicaid, but are actually receiving it. So we've seen independent analysis that says there's about 2 million illegal immigrants on the program, another 4 or so individuals that are able-bodied but choosing not to work, and then another 1.2 million people that are receiving Medicaid benefits across 2 different states. So they're being double counted, which means the states get that money. So, when you add it all up, you're talking about potentially millions of people that are using the program that really should not be eligible for the program. And Medicaid is becoming a $1 trillion a year entitlement program. It's ridiculous. It's almost as much as the national as our national defense, how much we pay every year for our military. So I think when we look at the program, we need to say, hey, what's working, what's not working? How can we trim and protect it for those that actually need it? Because there are people in this country that certainly need it. And how do we say we need to cut back? And then, one thing that is a little frustrating is, we say we're cutting Medicaid, we've cut Medicaid. We're just slowing the growth of Medicaid. We're trimming that curve. And of course, we would like to see the program be reduced, and we can actually revert it to the trend that has been established over the past 30 years. But to say that we are completely gutting Medicaid is just a fallacy. It really is a trim of about $100 billion a year. I think it's about a $1 trillion we'll cut over the next decade. So it is entirely accurate to say we're cutting Medicaid. We're just slowing the growth of it.
Right. Washington speak for cuts is always interesting because there's never actually a cut. It is slowing the growth. So still increasing, just not as fast as some folks may want.
Yeah, and for us in the limited government pro-taxpayer movement, that's always the most frustrating part about these things is, a cut is just a slow in spending. A real cut is a year-over-year reduction in the dollar amount that we've spent. And I think that's the place where we need to be. And when you said we're $37 trillion in debt, it's because of those same policies that have said a cut is just a slower growth in spending, which is just not accurate. And I think that's sort of the frustration that has bubbled up with people in the grassroots movement and the Tea Party movement over the past 15 years, where we say we're cutting, but we're not actually cutting.
So why don't they talk about it differently? I mean, you're so eloquent in how you talk about this bill and what the real savings are, and you don't have any spin in what you're saying. So why don't Republicans just say, hey, we're not cutting Medicaid. We're actually we're increasing. The Democrats wanted to increase Medicaid 40%, and we're only going to increase it 20%.
That's a really good question. I wish I could answer it. I think it's just easier to explain when you say you've cut something rather than say have a 10-word answer for what we think is a cut. That's not actually a cut. And I think part of it is why we didn't get more cuts is just this very tight majority that Speaker Johnson has. He has a 3 to 6 seat majority depending on the day. So we're not going to be able to get these significant reductions across the board with the current majority that we have. And I know that's a cop-out answer, but it's honestly the truth. And I really give the Freedom Caucus so much credit. Originally, Mike Johnson had proposed, I think, about $200 to $300 billion worth of cuts in the spending reductions in the initial bill, which is great. I'm always happy to talk about reductions and how much we're spending. But at the end of the day, the final bill that got passed, we increased that by about 4 times, and we received about $1.1 trillion worth of spending reductions. So we think that's a real great positive. It's an under-discussed win of the bill of how do we reduce the size of government. We set ourselves on the right path to get there. But I think if we really want to address the $2 trillion a year deficit that we have, we need to go about it through the regular order process and the appropriations process and say we need to spend less on every single department than we did last year. That's one step in how we get there. And then maybe even returning to pre-2019 levels of spending. That would save about $400 billion a year. So again, it's about 25% of our current deficits that we're running, but it's a step in the right direction. And then when you accompany that with economic growth, I really do think there's an opportunity to right size our budget and get back to a balanced budget that we had about 25 years ago.
Everybody was very excited about Doge when it first came on the scene. And I know Elon Musk leading it took a beating because of it, but they did uncover a lot of things that were, very shocking, I think, to a lot of people. I mean, a lot of us probably knew there was just a major waste going on, just one big grift, happening. But I think that really cinched it for the American public that they want to have accountability. What I don't understand from the Democrats in as far as the cuts is instead of going to outside these government buildings and, banging on the doors and saying, let us in and making a big stink, why don't they just sit down at the table and talk about things that they would cut? I mean, obviously they've got their pet projects. Republicans everybody has their pet projects, right? Typically Democrats want to decrease military spending. Republicans want to increase military. So to not even sit at the table and basically say nothing can be cut. I mean, that's essentially what they said, right? They didn't contribute any ideas. They didn't back any ideas. All they did was sit on the steps of the Capitol and sing songs, stand outside of buildings and bang on the doors. And I just think if you're not even going to sit at the table and talk about it, it doesn't make sense to me. And what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I just think the Democrats always find themselves on the other side of an 80-20 issue. And this is just one of them. I mean, everyone knows that there's government waste, right? I think you could be in first grade and know that the government probably spends too much money on silly stuff. And the Doge, I think, did a lot of great work to uncover some of that waste. And, kudos to President Trump for sending a rescissions package over to the House and it actually getting enacted. It was only $9 billion, but it's a step in the right direction. It's also the first time, I think, in 30-something years that a rescissions bill has actually been signed into law, which is an unbelievable statistic.
I didn't know that.
We only spend money in this town. And the fact that we're finally talking about how do we cut back is a much needed conversation. So whether it's $9 billion or $90 billion, I think either way, when we're talking about saving taxpayer dollars, it's a good conversation to have and it's a good action to take. So, that's just
that was an interesting fight too, because I kept hearing people say, I mean, it's $9 billion. Who cares? I mean, it's nothing. It's a drop in the bucket, a thimble in the ocean. And I thought, well, you got to start somewhere. It's kind of like losing weight. You've got to begin that first week and lose those first couple of pounds so that you can say, wow, my pants are a little looser. I think I want to try it next week and see if I can lose a few more pounds here. And before you know it, you've lost your first 10 pounds, right?
Yep.
And so I love equating everything to losing weight because people always think, oh, yeah, I totally get that.
And there's a lot of weight to lose with a $2 trillion annual deficit and $37 trillion in debt.
Exactly. I know there's we've got a couple of minutes left, but there's a couple of other things that were in that big, beautiful bill. One of them had to do with student loans. And I know that's been a big issue over the last few years with the student loan bailout that the Biden administration, I'd say they tried, but they did do a lot of bailout in spite of what a Supreme Court decision came back and said. Tell us about that provision too.
So the One Big Beautiful Bill finally puts to rest these terrible, misguided, unfair, expensive student loan bailouts that hopefully will never happen again. It saves about $240 billion over 10 years on paper. That's a very good thing. It also includes some other really good conservative wins, including the elimination of Grad Plus loans. These are loans that the federal government subsidizes for big white collar jobs like lawyers and doctors, graduate and professional students. And then it also imposes new borrowing caps for those very same individuals, where previously it was uncapped. Now you have $100,000 lifetime limit. That means you won't be able to take out these loans and just continuing to go to school and never pay them back, and expecting that the federal government will bail you out once the next administration comes in. So we think those are really good things. Of course, there's a lot more reforms that need to take place on the student loan side, particularly with the public service loan forgiveness program that was not touched. Same thing with the student loan interest deduction. Hopefully, as we have more conversations about a next reconciliation bill, those things will be part of those conversations, because the Department of Education is in dire need of reform and a wind down, to be honest with you. But I think these inclusions in the One Big Beautiful Bill, again, get the federal government out of the business of lending, and will actually allow private sector individuals to come in, pick up the slack, and give students and borrowers a little bit more understanding of what they're taking out, and the responsibility that when they take out these loans, they'll actually have to pay them back. I paid back my student loans. All of my friends did as well. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And I think that this actually gets at the heart of the problem that President Biden had established a few years ago.
I still think that there's another piece to that conversation, and that is bringing in these colleges and universities that have, had just an open spigot of money, government loans coming through to them, which has allowed them to, grow their administrative bloat, to build Taj Mahals across their campuses, all on the backs of these students, and to create degree programs, that frankly are not going to provide an ROI on the investment in the loan. I mean, how many students do you know that are taking, I know I'm going to be facetious here and probably make someone mad, but, sort of the study of getting rid of plastic straws or something like that. I mean, I'm sorry. There's just so many jobs to available in that area, if there is any. The gender studies, which has been this, explosion of studies, but I don't see an explosion of jobs that are available out there for students when they graduate. And so they're not getting jobs, and then they can't pay back their loans. I mean, it's just a vicious cycle. And so until we bring these universities into the conversation and force them to have some skin in the game. Some of these universities are sitting on millions, if not billions of dollars in endowments. They need to have skin in this game. And if they did, they would care about the success of these degree programs, and the ones that are not successful, they would go away off these university campuses.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better myself. And I would just add, as an 17, 18-year-old getting ready to go to school, there is no other loan that you could get when you have absolutely no credit, no assets, no history of repayment than a student loan. You can't get a mortgage, you could barely get a credit card, but you're able to take out upwards of $80,000 a year in student loan debt for 4 years. And I think it's that way because they know that the federal government is there to backstop these loans. It's not dischargeable in bankruptcy court. And that, again, has just fueled the ability for these colleges and universities just to continue to raise prices without offering students viable careers. And you mentioned gender studies. I think that there's just this perception that, you can get any degree and you'll be able to get a job right away. And in many cases, people that might have those degrees that can't go into business or get a real job, quite frankly, would come to Washington and work at some of these agencies in town because that's the only place that would hire them, whether it's USAID or others. And it's part of this same cycle that, government is there to take care of you, whether it's to bail you out, give you health care, give you EBT benefits, housing. At the end of the day, this federal government, we need to trim it. And I think hopefully with the One Big Beautiful Bill, we get on that process of actually getting that ball rolling.
I hope so. Well, tell us where folks can go and find out more about the National Taxpayers Union and what you all are doing over there.
Yeah, you can find us at ntu.org and follow us on Facebook and X under the same handle, NTU.
Great. Well, Tommy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on Main Street Matters. We're America's small business megaphone. And thank you all for taking the time to join in. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast from, and we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye for now.